Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Charity Village webinar. We will get started in just a moment. We just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to join us before we begin the session. We have people tuning in from across the country today, which is excellent. It's so nice to have all of you here. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's Charity Village webinar. My name is Mercedes and I'm the Marketing and Communications Specialist with Charity Village. As we are gathering here on a virtual platform, it is important to acknowledge that each of us is joining this webinar from the ancestral or unceded lands of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people. As a settler on this land, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation. The Charity Village head office is located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee people. Please join us in a moment of reflection as we recognize the Indigenous peoples as the stewards of this land. Let's acknowledge the mistakes and harm in our history and the ongoing injustices, and contemplate tangible actions each of us can take to move forward in a spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. For those who may be joining a Charity Village webinar for the first time, Charity Village is Canada's largest online job board for the nonprofit sector. In addition to our online job board, organizations can also post volunteer positions. So if you are looking for work or to recruit talent in the sector, Charity Village is a great place to start. We also have a ton of excellent resources for nonprofit professionals, including online courses, articles, fundraising tools, and free webinars like the one we are presenting today. Before we start today's webinar, I would like to quickly run through some housekeeping items. You may have noticed when you joined the webinar that you were automatically put on mute. Since we have hundreds of participants in today's session, it is important for us to minimize the amount of background noise so that everyone can clearly hear the presentation. But you can still ask questions and make comments using the question box at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. Look for that at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions as you think of them, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. As a reminder, the Q&A box is private, so only the Charity Village and Capital W teams will see your questions. You can also email your questions to webinars@charityvillage.com. If you happen to encounter any technical issues with the webinar, whether with viewing the presentation or with the audio, please let us know in the question box or by sending us an email. We will do our best to get any technical difficulties resolved as quickly as possible, but in a worst-case scenario, please remember that we are recording today's webinar, and we will send you the full recording by email tomorrow. So if you get called away or disconnected, you will still be able to view the full presentation. And with that, I would like to welcome our presenters for today, the Capital W team.
Thank you so much to Charity Village for this opportunity to speak with you today. This presentation will focus on the future challenges charities and nonprofits might be facing. Given that 70% of all funding to charities currently comes from government sources, and there are a number of elections ahead, and one that just happened, we are centering this presentation on government relations. Our hope is that the content presented will support you in navigating potential turbulence. Likely you are here because you have concerns about what 2025 will bring and how your organization will be able to continue to resource its important work during these unforeseen times. So we welcome you all. Thank you for being with us today. Just a little bit about me. I am Catherine Babcock, and I am the founder and CEO of Capital W. I started Capital W in order to bring best practices and support to community organizations. From my work, particularly at the Canadian Women's Foundation, I noticed that communities that were working with the most vulnerable people themselves as organizations were vulnerable. So to equip us in this work, Capital W developed a data platform which contains 5 years of information on how all of Canada's 80,000 charities are resourced. A few things derive from that platform that I would just like you to keep in mind during this presentation. The charitable sector is, in fact, the largest public-private partnership in Canada. Of the more than $300 billion a year that flows through the sector, more than 70% of it comes from the three levels of government, with the overwhelming lion's share coming from the province. To break it down, 12 billion from the feds, 200 billion from the province, and 12 billion from municipalities. If government shifts priorities or there is contraction in grant making, it will have reverberations for us all. It is for this reason that I am delighted to turn the presentation over to Christopher Holtz, a government relations specialist.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So today's purpose, as Catherine has indicated, is to help charities and nonprofits in Canada prepare for 2025. We're on the verge of 2025, but a lot has happened in the last 6 or 8 weeks if you've been paying any attention to political developments this side of the border and south of the border. 2025 is likely to be a particularly turbulent year for a variety of reasons. And the purpose of today is really to focus on things that are within your control, what charities and nonprofits can do to better prepare for this period of uncertainty. It's not about being partisan, especially for charities and nonprofits. But the basis for this discussion is that you have government funding that you rely on to some degree to support your charitable purposes or your nonprofit activities. So an agenda for this afternoon is first understanding this period of uncertainty, meaning from a government change perspective or potential change perspective, there are a lot of things that will matter for organizations right across the country. In some cases, new opportunities may be emerging, but in others, there will be changes in policy perhaps and an impact on the funding that is typically available. So once we've talked a bit about that environmental scan, that environmental change, the next part of the presentation really is going to be focusing on what you can do. So specifically, assessing your organization and your government relations strategy in this changing context. 2, how to go about engaging political parties to help shape platform commitments for the elections that are yet to come. We'll talk about that in some detail. 3rd, strengthening relationships with public service decision makers, particularly in advance of an election period. And then lastly, to diversify our revenue sources. We'll talk about that and how to go about doing that. And then we'll have a question and answer period at the end and encourage everyone to type in your questions, and we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. And Marina and Mercedes will be reading those out. So just a little bit about me. So my name is Chris Holtz. I am a government relations advisor to Capital W. I'm also a principal for a government relations consultancy in downtown Toronto. I've had a 25-year career in the public affairs industry as a government relations consultant, a lobbyist, if you like. I've worked in government, so in the political side and in the public service. So that included working for several Ontario cabinet ministers, the chair of cabinet, the minister of energy, the minister of finance, and also as a public servant years before that. Most of my work is corporate in that financial services, energy and utilities. I work for some municipalities, a whole host of different industries. But I also do a fair amount with respect to charities and nonprofits, patient groups, citizens groups, etc. So would like to give you a sense about this unusual period. And why is it unusual, Chris? I'll say it this way. The number of elections that have happened or are to happen in the near short term is pretty remarkable. It does happen occasionally, but we've gone through 5 elections. There's 2 more to come that we can foresee. That's a lot of change. That's a lot of going to the polls. And there's a lot that's happening that I think candidly does have an impact on the environment, especially for charities and nonprofits. So when we talk about the elections, let's start with the one that we're probably most familiar with because of its significant media coverage. So the election, not just 4 weeks ago, of President Trump, his reelection, is substantive change for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about some of the policy things that have changed the agenda for Canadian governments in short order. But simply to say, when we're talking about elections, we're also conscious of what's just happened in the United States, which is pretty profound, not just for international politics and decision making, but certainly here in Canada. But in Canada, there have been a number of elections as well. In the last 4 or 5 weeks, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia have all gone to the polls. And if there's a theme for all of these, it would be that incumbent governments have lost ground. It's not to say that they've all lost, but the number of seats have been reduced. There's been a change in government in a couple cases. There's one exception, which is the Nova Scotia re-election of the Conservative government, which actually increased their seat count. It's not about getting to the details of this, but in almost every other case, there's been a decline in the level of support for incumbent governments, if not an outright change in government. And every one of those has an impact on the policy priorities of that government and will change the landscape that charities and nonprofits will have to engage. So there's 5 elections that we've just quickly zipped through. There's 2 more to come. So there's the national or federal election process, which we will all be aware in Canada that it was scheduled for October of 2025. In the last 2 months, that's changed dramatically because of the NDP's decision to withdraw from the supply and confidence agreement. And we're in a period of chicken, I suppose, if I could use that term, in that every 3 months there are about 8 opposition day motions, any one of which can trigger an election. We've gone through several votes very recently. There are more to come. There's some upsets, even in the last 24 hours, about the NDP support for a particular measure around GST reductions and rebates. But the simple point is this is a very contentious, challenging, unpredictable environment in Ottawa, and that will continue to be the case until the election's triggered. Most pundits would say that the government is likely to survive at least until the budget and the spring. The fall economic statement for the federal Liberals has yet to be released. It's already December, but I won't say expect because everything is so dynamic. What I would simply say is it is a very uncertain time. One other thing I would also say is what's interesting about this unique period is a number of policy measures are being raised that were not really on the radar screen. The fact that there's a GST reduction or rebate checks to Canadians is pretty extraordinary. That came out of almost nowhere. There were other things earlier in the last 2 or 3 months around pension reform, etc. It's a number of measures that are happening, and there'll be more to come. Just a moment about polling. For what it's worth, the Conservatives have been in this position at almost 42% for quite some time. It's not new. It's been the case for 10, 11, 12 months. What's perhaps more important is what's on the right-hand side, which is that the seat count, the projected seats, is what many would call supermajority territory. What's that? Simply means that if it's 172 seats to have a majority government in Canada, which we haven't had for a few years, they will have, if an election were held today and nothing has changed, they're a significant majority government. I will just say, in the last few years, polling has gotten a pretty bad rap in the US, certainly here in Canada. And that's not to say that this will stay the same. This unique period is quite dynamic, and I would expect some of these numbers to change, but simply to say this is the current frame as of now and has been for quite some time. One other thing that I think is very important, which is for the purposes of this presentation and the recording, the currency date for this is December the 5th, just after 1 p.m. Eastern time. Why do you say that? I say this because things have become so dynamic that there's always a possibility that an election will be triggered maybe in a couple days, maybe early next week. So just for the purposes of the recording and for this group, that's the dynamic period that we're in. Let's talk about Ontario for a moment. So I've said 7 elections. The next one will be the Ontario government, which the Ford Conservatives have been pretty explicit since the spring that they're looking to seek an election early. The current time frame was of spring of 2026. They've been pretty adamant that they're looking to go in the spring of 2025, so a year early. And over the last several months, and will continue, they're building the case for an election for that spring. And why is that? A number of reasons. They are also well ahead in the polls and have been for quite some time. This isn't new. The election of Bonnie Crombie as the leader of the Ontario Liberals, I think for many conservatives see that as somewhat of a threat because of our position to be more centrist. We'll talk a little bit about that, not to get into the politics of it, but about why for an election so early. The other reason I think, candidly, is the Conservatives' fundraising is quite substantial. But the other reason would be that the Conservatives are concerned that a federal election and potentially the election of a Pierre Poilievre will have an impact on the Conservative brand. So the idea is an election in the spring is something that Ontario is certainly seeking. So just to set the context, what we're suggesting is these potential changes in government, we've gone through a number of elections and there's more to come, changes the environment for charities and nonprofits, and it certainly changes the environment for business. Half of the presentations that I've done in the last 6 weeks typically are related to the corporate Canada folks. The other half have been related to the charities and nonprofits that we act for. So those potential changes in government are a concern, especially because potential changes in government absolutely have a change in the policy priorities of a government. That's a significant amount of uncertainty for charities and nonprofits in two respects. Government funding, in the sense of charities and nonprofits that rely on fee-for-service models to deliver the services you generate on behalf of your stakeholders. For your grants and contributions that you might have, let's say a 2-year grant and contribution that you're looking to renew, the level of renewal or the funding that may be available may be impacted. And candidly, it probably will be impacted based on some of the things that are happening. And the other major change, of course, is policy goals of governments, of course, reflect the times and reflect the priorities of a party that may be elected. That may create new space for charities and nonprofits if you're in a particular space. And for others, it may be more of a problem. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. This slide is actually based on a study from one of our colleagues at Capital W that looked at federal and the Ontario governments over a long period of time and some of the significant policy changes that had an impact on the charitable and nonprofit sector. Some of you may be very familiar in Ontario during the NDP government, the Ray days, social contract. There was a reduction in funding at a certain point that really had an impact on the charitable sector. During the Harris-Eves Conservative government, the Common Sense Revolution focused funding in certain areas and certainly cut funding in other areas, and a substantial impact to the charitable nonprofit sector. But that also happened at the federal level with cost containment, cuts that were downloaded to provinces that had an impact as well. The point of this slide is simply to say that doesn't matter the brand of government. When there's a change in government, there is an impact on policy priorities. And the economic environment also clearly has an impact on the funding that is available to charities and nonprofits. That should not be a surprise to any of us. But what's perhaps interesting is it's a consistent thing every time a government changes. And it's in that vein that we want to make sure that folks are aware of this, especially with all these elections that are happening. So it's one thing to talk about the politics and election campaigns, but I think what's perhaps more important is understanding what are some of the policy priorities. And if it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, this list would be a list of Canadian priorities that were set by political parties. But many of the things on this list have little to do with Canada, but it's actually more in relation to what the new U.S. administration is proposing. It's without question that tariffs are the number one issue, the number two issue, the number 5 issue. This is something that we were saying 6 or 8 weeks ago. If Donald Trump were to be reelected, I would say that the key change here is that while we thought this might be an issue later in 2025, certainly post June the 20th, when the U.S. president assumes the office, it's already an issue in the last 2 weeks. We've all seen that in the media. So that is the number one issue because of the economic impacts. Number 2, on the Canadian economy. strong or weak, whatever it was 2 or 3 months ago, this now is actually a much more significant concern. Economists have been outspoken that tariffs, depending on their length, and that, i.e., until this is resolved, will have a significant impact on the Canadian economy. And that means potentially a possible recession. So this changes the framework for all the parties that are running at the federal level, and candidly for all the provincial governments that currently are in place. The Canada-US border would not have been an issue. That would have been in my bingo card. It is clearly now an issue. It's potentially one of the trade-off options to resolve this tariff issue on the list number one. And candidly, I think for a lot of Canadians, the concern would have been illegal migrants in the United States coming to Canada as a sense of refuge. But it's actually also vice versa, that Canada, surprise to many Canadians, is an avenue into the United States for illegal migration going south. Something that probably was not on the radar screen of a lot of people, but it's clearly an issue that's been raised, and now is something that already the Canadian government, the Justin Trudeau government, have explicitly said that we are making significant investments to address this, and that will be across the board for all parties. Again, not something that was on the radar screen 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's number 3 probably on this list. This is not in any particular order, except for number 1 for sure is on the list. A little bit more. So the reduction in government spending is something that I think all parties, I won't say that. Certainly the Liberal Party, the federal Liberals, have been signaling for some time, and the Conservatives substantially more, that there will be a reduction in the amount of investment that is available. And for the charitable and nonprofit sector right across the country, 80,000 charities, there'll be winners and losers in this, but what's important is that amount of funding is going to change. So we need to be mindful of that. Affordable housing, or affordability rather, and housing continues to be an issue. That's a Canadian-based issue for sure. And then the last one briefly is defense spending. Again, would not be on anybody's bingo card for a priority of government. Why would that be a priority today? Because an unreliable partner in the United States, based on the whims of a president, means that we need to live up to our NATO obligations. It means that we will have to make those investments perhaps a lot faster than we had originally intended. And Canada has been a laggard in its defense spending for quite some time. Not a political statement, it is factual, but simply to say that this will now be more of an issue and there'll be a lot more investment than I think folks would have anticipated. I'm not going to read this quote, but the Conservatives have been pretty outspoken and explicit with respect to the role of government and the amount of spending that the federal government has done. This is Melissa Lantsman, the deputy leader of the Conservatives, and rather explicit on this. There are a variety of other things, and we don't need to get into all of the platform or the developing platform components, but this is something that I think is a clear signal. But in fairness, the Liberals have also been indicating as such that there's going to be a curtailment in the amount of spending. So now let's talk a little bit about Ontario and some of the policy priorities that appear to be emerging leading up to the election next spring. And I should just say, just for context, the stuff that I'm outlining appears to be the issue list or the agenda list for these parties. In some cases, the parties have been outspoken and have said specific things at the federal level. But we can anticipate, at least federally, the things that I just shared are things that are certainly for the Liberals and for the Conservatives are things that they're quite committed to. It'll be a little bit different for some of the other parties. So now let's focus on Ontario. For the Conservatives, if you're in Ontario, if you're a charitable nonprofit based in this province, it'll be things that are related to tax cuts and rebates. That's been quite outspoken. That was in the fall economic statement just a few weeks ago. Infrastructure spending, significant amount of infrastructure spending is already underway and will continue. And then a third thing would be the role of private and nonprofit entities in the delivery of healthcare services. The Conservative government has been pretty outspoken on this, and there will be a lot more to come. Perhaps the last one, and it's been an ongoing policy priority for some time, is housing and planning reform, which is significant and dramatic in ways that many municipalities and residents do not necessarily fully appreciate, but that's an area where there will be significant ongoing impact for some time. For the Liberals, they've been much more outspoken very recently with respect to the position of the party, which has gone from left-leaning to much more centrist under the leadership of Bonnie Crombie. The Liberal leader has been clear that her three priority areas, and there may be more to come, and there may be more expansive in the weeks and months ahead, but the three priority areas are the following: that every Ontarian is to have access to a family doctor, because there's a significant issue in this province. There's a significant issue in almost every province. This is not unique. Secondly, surprisingly perhaps, tax cuts for families. It's something that the Liberal leader is quite committed to and has been outspoken about it. And third, public safety and crime, addressing crime concerns. That's a third area where the party seems to be moving, and that's based on speeches by the leader. For the NDP, their policy platforms are developing. It's affordability, a new deal for municipalities, which to a great degree is the delivery agent for a lot of government services, working with charities and nonprofits, of course. But that's an area where there's a lot of interest by the NDP in uploading some of the downloaded services and responsibilities that the Harris-Eves Conservative government previously had done. And affordable housing, getting back into the development of affordable housing by municipalities, by the province. That's an area of interest as well. None of these are locked. None of these policy priorities are fully complete. There's a process that's still underway, and there's an opportunity to engage, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple minutes. But this is the area currently that we can foresee is where the three parties are going for the Ontario election. And for the other provinces that we've already gone through, those issues are already resolved because those parties have been elected, as we shared earlier. So let's move on. So we've gone through an environmental scan. We have a sense now about the environment. The next part of this presentation is really to focus on what we can do as charities and nonprofits, what you can do as charities and nonprofits to address this period of uncertainty. And the four things are to assess your government relations strategy and your organization in this changing context that's relevant to you, how to go about engaging parties on platform commitments at the federal level in Ontario, if you're an Ontario-based charity or nonprofit. Third, how to strengthen relationships with public service decision makers in the context of an election to come at the federal or Ontario level, in this case. And then diversifying revenue sources. A key message here is, should we wait to see what a government proposes to do? Should you wait to see, are they going to do cuts? Are they going to do more investments? I think the answer to such a leading question is, of course not. There is an urgency to more seriously look at the existing revenue sources and identify opportunities to diversify, because an over-reliance on government funding can be a challenge, especially if there's a dramatic policy change. So we'll talk a bit about that. So when we talk about assessing, I'm using a bit of an analogy with respect to turbulent seas, rocking boats, storms on the horizon. Perhaps the first thing you do when you are in a boat and there's a storm on the horizon is you look to see what's in the boat. What do we have? Do we have a map? Do we have extra sails, life jackets? Do we have a bucket? Does the bucket have a hole in it? I say that because the very first thing before any organization starts to make decisions about how you're going to engage or operate is you need to really do an assessment of what is it that we actually have. And that includes things like, do we have a government relations strategy that's working? What is the relationship that we have with decision makers? Are we even known as an entity? Do we have a relationship with public servants? Are we considered a laggard? Are we known at all? It doesn't matter what the answers are. What matters is that you have answers to those questions, because that really will help to guide, well, what do we do under these circumstances? Some of the other questions are things like, we are an organization that's in a particular policy area. There are other organizations, maybe they do better than we are, maybe they do provide services not as effective as we do. Is there an opportunity to partner? Are they competitors? having an understanding of that broad environment really does help to determine what do we need to do as organizations as we're about to prepare and update our strategy and in our engagement mechanism with government decision makers. I'm going to spend just a minute on this. It's helpful if you're looking in the boat to see what you have, what tools you have. I'm not a sailor, by the way, but we're using the sailing analogy. I think it's helpful to think about it, the tools, into three categories: relationship building tools or tactics, political capital or policy capital building tactics, which is perhaps the most important, hint, hint, and I'll come back to that, and then government communication engagement. So some of these things are going to be obvious, but there's some nuance here that I think is important. So relationship building is a constant for any organization, corporate Canada, the smallest charity. It's really important that relationship building is a constant activity. So that includes using your organization's events, your AGMs, your graduation ceremonies for participants in your job training program, whatever it may be, as an opportunity to engage with civil servants and political decision makers in your community. It's highly recommended. It's critically important, and it's an ongoing effort. Certainly, participating in government announcements, consultations, and events is another mechanism to build those relationships. But the key point is your boards, your staff, your leadership of your organization, your EDs, etc., need to be active in this effort. Let's now spend a little bit more time on building political or policy capital. So what I mean by this is, for many organizations, and it doesn't matter if you're the biggest bank in Canada or you're the smallest nonprofit, building political or policy capital is often a constant priority. And there's lots of ways that organizations can do this. The most common, and this I think will be maybe obvious, is coalition building. What do you mean? What I mean by this is many organizations may be in a particular policy frame, let's say housing or affordable housing or drug treatment, addressing drug addiction, let's say. By partnering with multiple organizations, maybe in multiple communities across a province or across Canada, you can build a bigger case, a more important case for government to fund a particular initiative or a particular strategy to address a particular problem. And it's more comprehensive. It's easier for government in a way to deal with organizations that can demonstrate a national presence or a regional presence or a province-wide sort of effort to address a particular problem. It also helps to leverage the local political constituencies that may be relevant for government decision making. So coalition building is a common effort, and it can be very effective at building the attention and interest, which you can leverage into things like media and earned media, and meetings with decision makers, maybe at the deputy level, maybe at the ministerial level. Whereas a small organization would have difficulty doing that, 22 organizations may have a better approach to do that. Just on government communication, the meeting campaign process, what I would simply say is certainly that is where the rubber hits the road. Organizing those types of meetings and discussions is critically important from a message standpoint, from a delivery standpoint. That's the other function. That's the proof point of whether or not your government relations strategy is tracking or not tracking. So it's a critical function as well. But typically, the building the political or policy capital, what I'm calling that category, there's lots of different ways to do that. They're identified here. That's probably the one that's most important, and typically in any strategy I've ever done, this is what we use as a tool. So let's just a moment on coalitions and collective action. I think I've already discussed it, but I would simply say, like, I have done organizations like of 150 municipalities to build a case for provincial government action to change law. I've done it for grassroots groups and others, but that collective action, especially for charities and nonprofits who are smaller and may not have the resources to be able to deliver a complex, comprehensive government relations strategy. Collective action can be, if organized, a very effective mechanism. Okay, let's talk about platform engagement. So this is in the context of an election that hasn't happened yet, that is on the horizon that we can see. And for the purposes of the currency date for folks today, really we're talking about the federal election to come and the Ontario election in this case, because the other provinces have already completed for the time being. So when we talk about platform engagement, we're talking about political platforms, like some of these famous ones that many of you will remember or fear, depending on your point of view. The Red Book, Jean Chrétien during the early 90s, the federal Liberals, the Common Sense Revolution for the Conservatives in Ontario under Mike Harris. Regardless of the party, the point is for many businesses, charities, and nonprofits, getting into a platform is the ultimate in getting what we want, getting something that is a commitment by a party if they're successful. It's not the only mechanism, but it's great if it's in print because maybe a government will even do it. That's a joke. I say that because most of the time when it is in print, governments will make a significant effort to try and deliver on what has been communicated. But it need not be in a platform document. It can be in other mechanisms like a letter by a minister or a leader of a party in the midst of an election campaign. Let's just talk about how to engage in platform development. So the more time that's available, the better off we are. But even in the shortest of time frames, even in the midst of an election, it is possible to build the case for a political party to commit to do something. It's not easy. I've done it. It's very difficult, but it can be done. I'll give you an example. We acted for a series of municipalities, and in the midst of an election around a particular region of municipalities, there was a commitment by a party leader to do something which was the exact opposite. The person was briefed incorrectly, was the exact opposite of what these municipalities were really seeking. And by that point, this coalition, I think, was only about 80 municipalities, which is still a lot. We were able to turn that into a formal letter from the leader, basically stating what the commitment was going to be, which was a complete reversal of what he said to media about 24 hours earlier. It's not recommended, but it is possible. So my simple point in that is, even in the dark days of an election, it can be possible to generate a commitment as late as that, but not recommended. The more typical way is early engagement. And even at the federal level, there's still an opportunity. Even at the Ontario level, there's still an opportunity. So that includes engaging ministers' offices, opposition critics that are relevant to your policy area, building a relationship with your local representatives, your MP or MLA or city councilor if it's a municipal issue. Certainly using media, if it's sustained media, to build maybe the profile of your organization or addressing a particular issue. That's another opportunity as well. All simply to say, getting platform commitments is something that organizations are all mindful of, whether you're a business, whether you're corporate Canada, or you're a small nonprofit in a part of the country. That's something that I think folks are always mindful of, and there is an opportunity to do that, and these are examples or mechanisms to do so. We've talked about platforms. Let's talk a little bit about engagement with public service decision makers in the context of an election that is to come, and specifically around civil servants developing the briefing materials for potentially a new government, new ministers, and their political staff. So why do we want to do this? Well, we want to do this because we want to ensure that our input can be somehow reflected in the material that the deputy will present to the new incoming cabinet, or the clerk of cabinet to the new premier or prime minister. So the engagement process is as early as is possible, but as late as is necessary. And it includes certainly meeting with decision makers at the civil service that you may already have a relationship with, maybe because of a funding agreement and you have a report back mechanism. It may be, at a higher level, ideally with ADMs and maybe ultimately the deputy minister that's responsible for your area. And to the extent that there's a network of organizations that you are perhaps able to partner with, the more likely you are to get the attention of those decision makers and provide input into that process, whether it's about the solutions that you deliver or the outcomes that you generate because of the government's investment, or the shape of a particular issue and the concern about the forecast that this issue is going to get much worse, so we need X kind of investment. The simple point is engaging with civil servants in advance of an election at least builds the opportunity to form that relationship, but perhaps also to shape the briefing materials that those decision makers will ultimately provide to the incoming cabinet once it's sworn in, whether it's a re-election of a government or otherwise. Just a couple minor points. Well, not minor, but a couple quick points. There is a blackout period. What's that? The blackout period typically is when writs are issued, when the election formally takes place. Governments and civil servants specifically hold back a bit with respect to stakeholder engagement, consultation processes, etc. So the objective is to get well ahead of the caretaker period, the blackout period, which typically is 4 to 6 weeks, and potentially longer, because once a new government is elected, there is some delay in how quickly civil servants can engage. There's other things here that I think are perhaps helpful. You'll all be getting a copy of the presentation deck, so certainly these are things to be mindful of. One little point I would simply make is civil service engagement, engaging with public servants, is not about being political. Obviously, we need to be mindful of the politics. We need to be mindful of what parties are proposing or saying, but it's not about engaging in political activity or I think this is great about this particular party or not. I think that's probably obvious. You'd be surprised how not obvious it is to others, but I just want to make sure that that point is clearly communicated. I'm going to turn over now to my colleague, Nidhi Batoya, and she's going to walk through the next few slides. Nidhi?
Thank you, Chris. My name is Nidhi Batoya, and I've been a passionate fundraiser for 2 decades. I've worked on fundraising initiatives as large as 200 million, and I have secured 7-figure gifts for arts and health charities. And I've overseen fundraising teams with revenue lines including major gifts, special events, legacy giving, and direct response. In my work with Capital W, I bring fundraising best practices from some of the larger shops to small and medium-sized community organizations. Next slide, if you could, Chris. Risk mitigation or gateway to opportunity. So the question I have for you is, how aware of external threats to your organization are you? We know that there is a federal election coming. Chris talked a little bit about the economy, as well as the potential cutbacks that we might see in the sector. But there are other factors that need to be considered as well. There is the advancement of technology, which is likely to be a disruptor for this sector. And there are other factors that are not predictable, like a climate disaster, for example. But all of these factors have very real implications for you as nonprofit leaders and for your organizations. There is a lot of data on what happens to charities that are able to survive during turbulent times. And we can look as far back as the Great Depression, SARS, the 2008 financial crisis, and even COVID. And what we see are a few trends, a few things that these charities have in common. One is that they will innovate. They will actually carve out new revenue channels and evolve as an organization. That's one way. Another way that we see charities surviving is by relying on their philanthropic revenues. And what we know is that charities have a relationship with their donors, and that during difficult times, donors may give less, they may even stop giving, but that they will come back over time. So organizations will go lean and rely on their philanthropy to get them through. And the other thing that we see that happens is that charities will amalgamate with another organization. And so it's important for you to think about your revenues. And as you're all aware, we look at revenue in 3 buckets, 3 distinct buckets. One is government funding, another is philanthropy, and the third is earned revenue. And it's not that we expect revenues across all three buckets, but just to look at how dominant one particular revenue source might be and what that means for your organization, and for you to think about how you might diversify funding in any one area or across the buckets if that is relevant to your organization. Next slide, please. So Catherine mentioned a little bit about the data points around the funding for the sector. And when we look at the whole pie, philanthropy plays an outsized role. If you're not engaged in philanthropic revenue sources, it might be a good time to consider it. Too often, organizations believe that hiring a fundraiser will resolve their funding issues, but fundraisers need a full cycle, a 12 months, and I would argue 18 months before you will begin to see incremental gains. And they also need the right infrastructure for their work to succeed. So the key here is to think about incremental gains. Again, you know that it costs money to raise money and it takes time. And so start by looking at what your assets are. Where do you need the money? What programs and services? How much do you need? Think about your financial planning. It will be critical. Do you have the financial infrastructure to accept revenues? And do you understand the timing of the revenues that would come in and the delivery requirements back to the funder? Also going to need support from your board members and other senior volunteers. Just as programming requires delivery partners, you need partners to support your revenue generation. Next slide. So what now? It's really important that you think beyond a 12-month funding cycle and begin embedding a longer-term revenue sustainability plan. A good way to do that is to revisit your strategic plan. And you also need to start thinking about your communications, internal and external communications. It's a good time as we look at what's happening politically to reinforce the core purpose of your organization and the relevance of what you do. And finally, it's a good opportunity to engage your stakeholders, speak to your funders and your partners and your allies, be transparent, and ask for what you need. Thank you.
So just some final thoughts from Nidhi and Catherine and myself from Capital W. So first is, we've talked a lot about change, the number of elections that are taking place and still to come, and the policy changes that are happening, and the policy agenda items that are completely changing in response to some jurisdictions that are profoundly impact our country. I'm talking about the US, of course. So change can be an opportunity in some cases, and I'll give you an example. When we talked about Canada-US border relations, and I think the concern around the number of illegal migrants perhaps that are in the United States that are looking for refuge maybe to Canada, one of the things that municipalities very quickly indicated, like right along the border, like within a day of the election of President Trump, was that we'll need more funding support to be able to support folks that may be coming across. That's quite something that I think candidly is an opportunity for organizations that are in that space that do this important work to have the resources to be able to manage it, to be partners of our municipalities that are along the border. That's just one example. There are multiple others. So I'd simply say some of these changes actually present unique new opportunities, but for others it may be a more challenging environment, and I think that certainly is a message that's probably come across. Part of this is to think about the big picture. How do we fit what's coming, what's relevant to us as an organization, a large nonprofit perhaps in Vancouver or a very small nonprofit in Halifax? We need to figure out how we fit and how we can navigate under these circumstances. I would say as a message for all of us is to monitor the developments that are going to be relevant to you as your organization in the policy space where you operate. That's going to be very important in the next 12 months, if not already underway. And I would also say for all charities and nonprofits, do your homework and move quickly. So when Nidhi was saying about diversifying revenue sources, an important message would be this, that don't wait until it becomes apparent and very acute that there's a funding shortfall because the government of Manitoba, I'm just making this up, it won't be Manitoba, but a government, let's say in Alberta, is looking to cut funding in a particular area. You need to get ahead of that, and part of that is doing the homework now to ensure that your revenue diversification strategy is workable and can be implemented. Second. So questions and answers. You have questions. We have some answers, I hope. I'm going to turn it to Mercedes, who I think will call out some questions, and Catherine and Nidhi and I will try and get as many as we can with the time that we've got.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. Okay, so the first question, will you please explain what tariffs are and how they will impact not-for-profits in Canada?
That's a great question. So I'll take that one quick. So tariffs, meaning tariffs on Canadian products that we make here that we would sell to the United States. Let's say it's steel. Let's say it's softwood lumber. It's like, well, we're not in the steel business. We're not in the softwood lumber business. We're a small charity. How would that impact us? Here's the reason why, or here's why it would matter. If we have tariffs on our products that we sell to the United States, we will lose a lot of revenue because we're not able to sell as much because we're not as competitive, because it's a 25% tax essentially on them. It makes our goods 25% higher. So what does that mean? It means that there's going to be job losses. It means that there may be a significant downturn in the amount of revenue that governments take in. It may mean it's the downstream effect of tariffs. That's really the concern. And what it also means is it becomes now the number one priority, whereas maybe a priority of a particular provincial premier might have been, we want to invest 4 times the amount in housing affordability or homelessness. Well, that might be on the list, but that might be number 8 on the list instead of number 1. Instead of this amount of money, it's going to be this amount of money because we're dedicating a huge amount now to funding supports for people who are now unemployed or whatever. So my simple point is, or the simple answer is, tariffs are a tax that the U.S. government would impose on Canadian goods that are being sold to the U.S. It makes our products much more expensive, meaning that U.S. buyers of our products are looking to other sources. So there's a direct impact on the number of sales of product that we can sell. And it's much more complicated when you're in the auto sector or some of the companies that I work for, where we have products that go back and forth maybe 6 times or 26 times between the border because there's components that come from this and that or whatever. That's a long answer to an important question. Sorry, back to you, Mercedes.
Thank you, Chris. So how do you anticipate changes in government and governmental funding could impact funding from private foundations?
So maybe I'll turn that over to my colleague Nidhi or Catherine.
Sure, I'll start, and Catherine, if you'd like to add. I think that the messaging that Chris has provided goes the same for speaking to your foundations. And so I would engage them in messaging that it's an important time for their support to continue to the sector now more than ever, with the uncertainty that we are seeing. So it's a great time to, just as Chris said, build those relationships, do some outreach, and continue to message why your organization needs to be considered a priority.
And I would add to that there are 10,000 foundations in Canada, public and private foundations, and their disbursement quota, of course, is standardized, but their contributions become really critically important in terms of making the case and supporting the government overall. So we talk about outside of the ballot box philanthropy is an important vote about the kind of world that we want to live in. They're very important in terms of building a coalition or a case or demonstrating. And although in terms of the large funding for charities, foundations represent less than 10%, they are those donors are critical to endorsing, supporting the sector, and they might become critical allies in terms of special requests. And so really to cultivate those relationships.
Thank you very much. And then the last question, are there any outreach tips for charities in provinces where the provincial elections have already happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a few things. So first off, the parties that are elected, their platforms are a guiding document for you. So the trick will be to figure out how you fit in the platform commitments that the party made that is just elected to government. Second thing would be mandate letters. So what's a mandate letter? A mandate letter is a letter from the premier to a minister in cabinet that essentially provides their marching orders. In some cases, those letters are public. If you Google it, you should be able to find it. Not all governments release them. That's been an issue in Ontario, actually, but that's a very clear indication of what the priorities are of that minister, that the premier or the prime minister has delivered. A couple other things, look to speeches that might be relevant from your minister, the policy area that you're most interested in. You might have multiple policies or multiple ministers, so you need to be mindful of that broader sense. Monitor the media. That's a lot of answers to one question, but those are the kinds of things that you should do. At some point, engaging the civil service will be something, but the timing of that really depends on what it is you want, what are you looking to do, and the answers to those questions or those items that I've just talked about. Back to you.
Thank you very much for presenting such an informative webinar. Do you happen to have any final comments before we sign off today?
Yes, thank you so much. We actually have an SOS opportunity. So we've created Sustainable Organization Services, SOS, and we might be able to help you in terms of creating a roadmap to diversified revenue, embedding our team of fundraisers into your organization, or providing coaching for the challenges ahead. If you would like more information, just put in the Q&A box, which is confidential, SOS, with your email, and we'd be delighted to connect with you. I also, in the final moment, want to speak about an emerging opportunity. Charity Village and Capital W share concern for the sustainability and thriving of community organizations. And we're exploring a customized package of services that would be designed for that purpose. We would appreciate knowing if that might be of interest to you, and if so, what would be most helpful. You will be receiving a survey from Charity Village, but Dave has also asked that you reach out to him directly if you have any thoughts about this at dave@charityvillage.com. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I just wanted to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the webinar recording. Please feel free to share this link with your colleagues. The email will also include a survey link that you can fill out with your feedback on today's webinar. You should see a survey link pop up right here in Zoom following the session as well. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for our next free webinar, Fundraising Basics for Small Nonprofits, How to Make Your Grant Search More Effective. You can find more information on this and all of our upcoming webinars at charityvillage.com/webinars. Thanks again for joining us today. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.